When an empath goes silent, it is easy for others to misunderstand what is happening. Silence is often framed as avoidance, as emotional immaturity, or even as a subtle form of punishment. But that interpretation misses the psychological truth entirely. This silence is not an impulsive reaction. It is not a tactic. It is the end point of a long internal process in which the empath has finally stopped negotiating for emotional safety. Empaths do not arrive at silence quickly. They arrive there slowly after years of explaining themselves in different ways, hoping that clarity will lead to care. They arrive there after repeatedly naming their needs, softening their tone, choosing their words carefully, and giving the benefit of the doubt. They arrive there after absorbing blame that was never theirs, after minimizing their own pain so someone else would not feel uncomfortable. Silence is not the first response, it is the last. From a psychological perspective, this moment represents a profound shift in the nervous system. The empath's body has learned through repeated experience that engagement no longer leads to connection. What once felt like hope now feels like exposure. The system stops trying to repair something that consistently causes harm. Silence emerges not as a decision of the mind, but as a wisdom of the body. It is the moment the nervous system says, enough. This is no longer safe. This is why the silence feels different from withdrawal. Withdrawal still carries emotional charge. There's still expectation, resentment, or longing underneath it. Silence, in contrast, is quiet because the emotional bargaining has ended. The empath is no longer trying to be understood by someone who has shown repeatedly that understanding is not available. That effort has been laid down. Philosophically, this moment is significant because it marks the end of self-abandonment. For a long time, the empath's identity may have been built around being attuned to others, often at the expense of their own inner life. Silence becomes an act of self-recognition. It is the moment they stop translating their pain into language for someone who refuses to listen and instead begin listening inwardly. This silence often feels shocking to those on the other side because it disrupts an unspoken contract. The contract was never verbalized, but it was deeply felt the empath would continue to explain, to forgive, to stay emotionally available no matter the cost. When that availability disappears, it feels sudden. But in truth, it has been coming for a very long time. What makes this silence so powerful is that it contains clarity. The empath is no longer asking, how do I get through to you? They are asking, why am I still here? That question changes everything. Once it is asked honestly, silence is not a strategy. It is a natural consequence. From a clinical lens, we might say this is the collapse of a trauma response. Many empaths learned early in life that maintaining connection required emotional labor, vigilance, and self-suppression. They became skilled at managing the emotional states of others because at some point that skill felt necessary for survival. Silence arrives when that strategy finally exhausts itself. The body realizes it cannot keep paying this cost without losing something essential. And so the empath stops explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally understand something important. Not everything that can be explained can be healed through explanation. Some dynamics do not change through insight. They change only when participation ends. This is where silence becomes a boundary rather than a wall. It is not meant to shut someone out in anger. It exists to hold the empath in integrity. It protects what remains of their emotional life. In that sense, silence is deeply ethical. It refuses to continue a pattern that is damaging to both people. For those witnessing this silence, it may feel cold or confusing, but for the empath, it is often accompanied by an unexpected sense of relief. There is grief, yes, but also a quiet dignity. The nervous system begins to settle. Energy once spent on constant emotional monitoring returns. There is space again to feel one's own thoughts, one's own values, one's own direction. This silence does not announce itself. It does not argue its case. It simply stands. And in standing, it reveals a truth that is easy to ignore, but hard to escape. Connection without safety is not connection at all. The silence of an empath is not the absence of care. It is the moment care finally includes the self. To understand what happens next, we need to look carefully at how narcissistic control actually works. Popular language often reduces it to vanity or ego, but psychologically, narcissistic patterns are far more precise than that. Control is not maintained through power alone, it is maintained through emotional access. Without it, the structure collapses. A narcissistic personality does not regulate itself from the inside. Emotional stability depends on what is happening externally, how they are being perceived, affirmed, reacted to. Other people function as mirrors and regulators. Attention, admiration, fear, confusion, even conflict all serve the same purpose. They confirm existence. They keep the inner sense of self from fragmenting. This is why emotional reactions matter far more than genuine intimacy. Empaths are especially vulnerable in this dynamic because they are emotionally responsive by nature. They notice subtle shifts in mood. They feel tension before it is spoken. They instinctively try to soothe, clarify, repair. In doing so, they provide a steady stream of emotional data, expressions, explanations, reassurance, distress. This is not weakness, it is attunement. But in the wrong relational context, attunement becomes fuel. What is often misunderstood is that narcissistic control does not require positive emotion. Anger works just as well as admiration. Tears are just as valuable as praise. Even resistance can be co opted as long as it keeps the empath engaged. As long as there is a reaction, there is leverage. The narcissistic system knows how to provoke precisely the response that restores its sense of dominance or relevance. This is why conversations in these dynamics feel circular. The goal is not resolution, the goal is activation. Every explanation becomes another entry point. Every emotional disclosure becomes another tool. The empath may believe they are moving toward clarity, but the narcissistic structure is only registering one thing: access has been granted. When the empath goes silent, that access disappears. There is no longer emotional material to work with, no tone to read, no vulnerability to redirect, no reaction to manipulate. From the outside, silence can look passive. Psychologically, it is the most destabilizing thing that can happen to a narcissistic system. Without emotional access, the narcissist is left alone with themselves, and that is precisely what the structure was designed to avoid. The sense of self begins to feel hollow, unanchored. Anxiety rises, rage or desperation may follow. This is not strategy, it is dysregulation. The external regulator has gone offline. From a trauma-informed perspective, this loss of control is not random. Many narcissistic patterns originate in early environments where emotional needs were either ignored or exploited. The child learned that authenticity was unsafe, but performance could secure attention. Over time, the performance becomes the self. Others are no longer experienced as separate beings, but as sources of emotional stabilization. When an empath stops responding, the illusion of control fractures. The narcissist may escalate behaviors, charm, guilt, threats, sudden vulnerability, not because they suddenly care more, but because the nervous system is scrambling to restore equilibrium. These are attempts to reestablish emotional supply, not to create mutual understanding. This is often the moment when empaths begin to see the dynamic clearly. The silence reveals what engagement concealed. They notice that apologies appear only when distance is enforced. They notice that concern emerges only when access is threatened. The absence of reaction becomes more informative than years of conversation ever were. Philosophically, this moment forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth control masquerading as connection is not love. If presence depends on reaction, it is conditional. If care disappears when emotional labor stops, it was never care, it was dependence disguised as relationship. For the empath, recognizing this can be painful, but it is also liberating. It clarifies that their worth was never located in how well they managed someone else's inner world. It was simply exploited there. Silence becomes not just a boundary, but a diagnostic tool. It reveals the nature of the bond. What follows is often a profound shift in power, though it does not feel like power in the traditional sense. There is no victory, no dominance. There is only disengagement. And disengagement in this context is transformative. It removes the empath from a role they were never meant to play, emotional regulator for someone unwilling to regulate themselves. The loss of emotional access is not an attack, it is a consequence. And consequences, unlike punishments, do not require intention. They simply follow reality. When you stop feeding a system that depends on your reactions, you discover a quiet truth: control only exists where you continue to participate. Once emotional access is gone, something deeper is touched, something far more sensitive than control itself. The empath's silence does not merely remove interaction, it activates a core wound that sits quietly beneath narcissistic defenses. To understand the intensity of what follows, we have to look beneath behavior and into the inner architecture of the narcissistic psyche. At the center of narcissistic organization is not confidence, But fragility, what often presents as superiority, is psychologically a shield built around a profound fear of being insignificant, unseen, or emotionally erased. Early in life, many individuals with narcissistic patterns did not experience consistent attunement. Their inner world was not mirrored with warmth or reliability. Instead of developing a stable sense of self, they learned to secure worth through external confirmation. Attention became survival. Recognition became proof of existence. This is why silence is so threatening. Silence does not argue. It does not accuse. It does not even reject in the traditional sense. It simply removes the mirror. And without the mirror, the narcissistic structure begins to destabilize. The empath's silence communicates something that words never could. You are no longer the reference point. For someone whose identity depends on being central in another's emotional field, this is profoundly disorganizing. What makes this particularly painful is that silence forces contact with an inner emptiness that has been avoided for decades. As long as someone else is reacting, positively or negatively, the narcissistic system feels anchored. When that reaction disappears, the individual is left alone with an unintegrated sense of self. The resulting feelings are often described as abandonment, humiliation, or annihilation, even when no one has actually left. This is where the reaction often appears disproportionate. The empath may simply stop engaging, but the response they receive can feel extreme rage, despair, sudden idealization, or frantic attempts to reconnect. These are not calculated moves in the way people often assume. They are nervous system responses to a perceived existential threat. The silence is experienced not as distance, but as erasure. From a psychological standpoint, this explains why narcissistic injury feels so intense. The injury is not to pride, but to identity. Silence confronts the narcissist with the possibility that they are not essential, not special, not required to be held in someone else's emotional awareness. For a psyche built around avoiding that realization, the impact is seismic. Empaths often underestimate this because their own sense of self does not rely on domination or centrality. They can tolerate being alone without feeling unreal. Narcissistic structures cannot. The empath's silence removes the external scaffolding that kept the narcissist's inner world upright. What collapses is not the relationship, but the illusion that the relationship was mutual. This is also why narcissists often reinterpret silence as cruelty. If one's internal experience has always depended on others providing emotional reflection, then the withdrawal of that reflection feels like an attack. The empath is cast as cold, heartless, or abandoning, even though they may simply be choosing not to continue a harmful dynamic. This reframing protects the narcissistic self from confronting its own dependency. From a philosophical lens, silence becomes a mirror of reality rather than a distortion of it. It exposes a truth that interaction had concealed, that the connection was asymmetrical. The empath was present as a person, the narcissist was present as a need. When the empath steps back, the imbalance becomes undeniable. For the empath, understanding this is crucial. Without this insight, they may feel compelled to re-engage out of guilt or confusion. They may interpret the narcissist's distress as evidence of love or remorse. But what is being expressed is not grief for the relationship as a shared bond. It is panic at the loss of emotional centrality. This does not mean the narcissist is consciously malicious. It means their emotional development was interrupted, leaving them dependent on others for regulation and meaning. Compassion does not require participation. Understanding does not require self-sacrifice. The empath's silence is not a failure of empathy. It is the point at which empathy finally includes reality. When silence activates this core wound, it teaches an important lesson to both parties. The narcissist is confronted with the cost of avoiding inner work. The empath is confronted with the truth that they cannot heal someone who does not wish to face themselves. And this is where silence does its deepest work. It reveals that being needed is not the same as being valued, and that the most loving act you can sometimes offer is to stop standing in for someone else's missing self. After silence has removed emotional access and exposed the underlying wound, what often follows is escalation. This is the phase people find most confusing because the behaviors can look deliberate, even theatrical. Sudden kindness, dramatic apologies, rage, blame, vulnerability, charm, sometimes all within a short period of time. It can feel chaotic, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. But psychologically, there is a clear pattern. What is collapsing is not the relationship, it is the strategy that once kept the narcissistic system intact. Manipulation, in this context, is not always conscious or calculated. It is a learned survival response. When earlier strategies stop working, the nervous system searches frantically for anything that might restore equilibrium. This is why the escalation often feels desperate. The goal is not reconciliation in the mutual sense. The goal is regulation. The narcissist is trying to regain emotional ground because the internal state has become intolerable. For a long time, certain behaviors reliably produced results. Guilt would pull the empath back into conversation. Anger would provoke explanation or reassurance. Vulnerability would activate caretaking instincts. Charm would soften boundaries. These were not random choices. They were conditioned responses shaped by repetition and reinforcement. When the empath goes silent, those conditioned pathways suddenly lead nowhere. This is when emotional collapse begins to show. Without feedback, the narcissistic system loses orientation. There is no longer a clear sense of cause and effect. Effort no longer produces control. This can manifest as emotional volatility, fixation, obsession, or sudden disengagement followed by renewed pursuit. What appears from the outside as erratic behavior is internally a system without an anchor. From a trauma-informed lens, this moment is revealing the narcissist's emotional regulation was never fully internalized. It depended on the empath's responsiveness to stabilize moods, soothe the insecurity, and confirm worth. Once that external regulator is removed, the system does what it was always doing, only now it does it loudly, visibly, and without success. Empaths often struggle here because they mistake collapse for insight. They see distress and assume growth is happening. They hear words that sound self-aware and believe something fundamental has shifted. But insight without integration does not lead to change. What sounds like accountability is often just another attempt to restore emotional supply. The empath's silence is the only thing preventing the old cycle from restarting. This is also the stage where boundaries are most tested. The narcissist may accuse the empath of cruelty, abandonment, or heartlessness. These accusations are not assessments of the empath's character. They are expressions of dysregulation. When emotional control is lost, projection increases. Pain is externalized because it cannot be held internally. Philosophically, this collapse confronts a core illusion that control can replace connection. For a long time, manipulation created the appearance of closeness. It kept people orbiting, responding, engaging. But control is inherently unstable. It requires constant maintenance. When it fails, there is nothing underneath to sustain relationship. For the empath, this phase is both the most difficult and the most clarifying. The urge to step in and soothe can be overwhelming. Empaths are wired to respond to distress, but responding now would mean re-entering the role of emotional regulator, reinforcing the very pattern that caused harm. Silence at this stage is not indifference, it is consistency. It is the empath choosing long-term integrity over short-term relief. This moment also reveals something important about change. Real transformation does not occur when manipulation works, it occurs when it doesn't. When strategies fail repeatedly, the possibility of genuine self-reflection finally emerges. Whether or not the narcissist chooses that path is not within the empath's control. What is within their control is whether they continue to enable avoidance of inner work. The collapse is not the empath's responsibility. It is the natural consequence of a system built on external regulation. No one can hold another person together forever. At some point, the structure either internalizes stability or falls apart. This is why silence matters. It does not punish. It does not provoke. It simply stops preventing reality from doing its work. When you refuse to rescue a collapsing system, you give both yourself and the other person the only honest chance for change, the chance to face what can no longer be controlled. When the noise finally stops, something unexpected begins to happen inside the empath. After years of being emotionally oriented toward another person's inner world, there is suddenly space. At first, that space can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Many empaths are so accustomed to monitoring, adjusting, and responding that stillness feels like absence. But slowly, if they allow it, that space reveals itself not as emptiness, but as return. For a long time, the empath's energy was directed outward. Attention was spent reading moods, anticipating reactions, preventing conflict, softening truths. This constant orientation toward another's emotional state creates a subtle form of self-erasure, not dramatic, not obvious, but cumulative. Needs are postponed. Feelings are diluted. Intuition is questioned. Silence marks the moment this outward flow reverses direction. Psychologically, This is a profound shift in regulation. The empath's nervous system, no longer tasked with stabilizing someone else, begins to reorganize around its own rhythms. Hypervigilance starts to ease. The body no longer braces for unpredictable emotional shifts. There's less scanning, less bracing, less internal negotiation. What replaces it is not immediately joy, but clarity. Clarity can be unsettling without the distraction of managing another person, unresolved feelings surface. Grief emerges for time lost, for boundaries crossed, for versions of the self that were compromised to maintain connection. This grief is not a sign of regression. It is a sign that the empath is finally safe enough to feel what was previously suppressed in the name of survival. From a trauma-informed perspective, this stage is about reclaiming authorship. When someone has spent years adapting to another's emotional needs, they often lose touch with their own internal signals. Silence creates the conditions for reattunement. The empath begins to notice what they feel without immediately translating it into action. They learn to sit with discomfort rather than fixing it. This is not passivity, it is maturation. Philosophically, this moment invites a reconsideration of responsibility. The empath realizes that compassion does not require self-sacrifice and presence does not require endurance. The belief that love means staying soothing and absorbing begins to dissolve. In its place emerges a quieter truth. Love that erases the self is not love, it is survival behavior misnamed. As this realization settles, something else changes. The empath's sense of identity becomes less reactive. Decisions are no longer shaped primarily by how others will respond. Values move to the foreground. What matters becomes clearer. What drains becomes obvious. Silence is no longer something they are doing to someone else. It becomes something they're doing for themselves. This is often when guilt arises. Old conditioning insists that stepping back is selfish, that boundaries are betrayals, that choosing peace is abandonment. These internal voices are echoes of earlier environments where the empath's needs were secondary or invisible. Recognizing these voices as learned rather than true is part of the reclamation process. As energy returns inward, the empath may notice a growing intolerance for emotional chaos. What once felt normal now feels intrusive. This is not hardening. It is discernment. The nervous system, having tasted stability, no longer mistakes intensity for intimacy. Calm begins to feel trustworthy. Importantly, this reclamation does not require anger or confrontation. It unfolds quietly through consistency. The empath learns to pause before responding, to check in with their body before agreeing, to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. These small acts accumulate into a fundamentally different way of relating. From the outside, this can look like withdrawal or detachment. Internally, it feels like coherence. The empath is no longer fragmented across someone else's needs. They are whole, present, and grounded in themselves. This stage also carries a deeper ethical dimension. By reclaiming their emotional energy, the empath stops participating in a dynamic that prevented growth for both parties. They are no longer buffering someone else from the consequences of their behavior. In this sense, self-reclamation is not only personal healing, it is relational honesty. What emerges is not a hardened self, but a more integrated one. Sensitivity remains, but it is no longer exploitable. Empathy remains, but it is no longer automatic. Choice returns. And this is the quiet revolution of silence. When you stop managing someone else's emotions, you finally gain the freedom to live your own life with intention rather than reaction. At this point, something fundamental has shifted, not just in behavior, but in structure. What finally ends the cycle is not confrontation, explanation, or even insight. It is the end of a role. And when a role disappears, the entire system that depended on it can no longer function in the same way. Narcissistic dynamics are sustained through unconscious role assignments. Someone must admire, someone must reassure, someone must absorb emotional volatility and translate it into stability. In relationships with empaths, that role is often accepted quietly and early. The empath does not agree to it explicitly. They grow into it through responsiveness, care, and a desire for harmony. Over time, this role becomes expected rather than appreciated. What keeps the cycle alive is not cruelty, but predictability. The narcissistic system learns that no matter how disruptive the behavior, the empath will eventually respond. They will explain. They will soften. They will try again. The relationship becomes less about mutual presence and more about maintaining a familiar emotional choreography. Silence breaks this choreography because it removes the performer. Without the empath playing their part, the script collapses. There is no cue to follow, no response to provoke, no emotional counterweight to lean against. This is why the cycle cannot continue once the empath truly disengages. There is nothing left to orbit. It is important to understand that this ending does not require distance alone. Many people create physical or conversational distance while still holding the role internally. They still anticipate reactions. They still rehearse explanations. They still feel responsible for how the other person feels. The cycle continues in subtle ways. What ends it is not absence, but internal withdrawal from responsibility that was never yours. From a psychological perspective, this is where differentiation occurs. The empath separates their inner life from the emotional demands of the other. They stop confusing empathy with obligation. They allow the other person to experience their own emotions without intervening. This is not abandonment. It is a restoration of appropriate boundaries. Philosophically, this moment challenges a deeply ingrained belief that relationships survive through endurance. In truth, unhealthy systems survive through role compliance. When one person stops complying, the system is forced to reveal itself. Either it reorganizes around mutual accountability or it dissolves. This is why silence is so final when it comes from this place. It is not a tactic waiting to be lifted. It is not leverage. It is a recognition that participation itself was the problem. Once this recognition is integrated, returning to the old role becomes psychologically impossible. The cost is now visible. For empaths, this can feel both empowering and sobering. There is relief in no longer carrying emotional weight that was never shared, but there is also grief in realizing how much of the relationship depended on their labor. That grief is part of the ending. It marks the transition from fantasy to reality. What often follows is a period of recalibration. The empath learns to ask different questions. Not, how do I fix this? But why would I accept this? Not, how do I explain myself better? But am I being met? These questions signal a new internal orientation, one rooted in self-respect rather than self-sacrifice. Ending the role also changes how future relationships are formed. The empath becomes more attentive to reciprocity. They notice whether care flows both ways. They pay attention to how conflict is handled, how repair is offered, how responsibility is shared. Sensitivity becomes guided by discernment rather than instinct alone. Importantly, this ending does not require blame. Blame keeps roles alive by maintaining emotional entanglement. Silence in its mature form is neutral. It neither condemns nor rescues. It simply steps out of a pattern that no longer aligns with reality. This is the quiet power of disengagement. It does not seek to teach a lesson. It allows one. Whether or not the other person learns from it is not the point. The point is that the empath is no longer available to be the missing piece in someone else's unfinished emotional development. When the role ends, the cycle ends, not because something was destroyed, but because something false was no longer maintained. And this is the final truth to carry with you. The moment you stop playing a role that costs you your integrity, you don't lose a relationship, you reclaim your life.